Okay, we are reading from The Manipulated Mind by Denise Wynn, and we are beginning Chapter 2, Brainwashing. To isolate the components of the so-called brainwashing process, it is necessary to take a detailed look at what went on in the Chinese prisoner of war camps in Korea. The American soldiers repatriated in 1953, who had seemingly collaborated with the enemy and adopted a communist viewpoint, albeit briefly, were not the first to focus world attention on the phenomenon of sudden political conversion. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin's Moscow show trials, where top Bolshevik figures publicly confessed to utterly fantastic crimes that they couldn't possibly have committed, and even seemed to have willingly adopted their prosecutors' view of them as scum, caused alarm to ripple far abroad. That staunch revolutionaries could suddenly have been transformed into groveling repentants was unthinkable. That some insidious process was at work became a reality for the Americans when their own men later succumbed to the Chinese and made equally fantastic confessions in some cases that the Americans had been engaged in biological warfare against the communists. So the experts were called in to try to find explanations. Their detailed analyses of the characters of the men, the stresses they were obliged to undergo, and the tactics used by the Chinese provide the most comprehensive picture of what has been called brainwashing. In later years, claims made in court that individuals such as Patty Hearst or members of cults had been brainwashed have all been based on the findings arising from Korea. Different experts have placed differing emphasis on the events that occurred and have sometimes offered up differing conclusions. It is worth reviewing their evaluations and drawing together all the common threads. Edgar Schein, an MIT psychologist, gathered his data in August 1953 at Incheon, Korea, when the repatriates were being processed, and on board the USNS General Black when the men were en route back to the United States during the first 2 weeks of September. In an article called "The Chinese Indoctrination Program for Prisoners of War, a Study of Attempted Brainwashing," published in Psychiatry in 1956, he outlined what had happened to the soldiers in Korea as told by them to him, and drew his own conclusions. He claimed as a result of his investigations that there was nothing new and terrifying about Chinese brainwashing techniques. They had, in effect, combined a number of traditional and well-known ploys to weaken resistance, such as group discussion, self-criticism, interrogation, rewards and punishments, forced confessions, exposure to propaganda, and information control. What was new was not the method, but the manner of combining in a systematic fashion a variety of tried and tested methods. The following description of events experienced in Korean POW camps is drawn from Schein's published version. The Chinese attitude to their captives differed even at the outset from that of the North Koreans. Whereas the latter were brutal to their prisoners, took their clothing away, deprived them of regular and sufficient food, and meted out heavy punishment or death if a prisoner tried to resist them, the Chinese welcomed captives with warmth, even congratulating them for having been liberated. Over the next few weeks and months, however, the soldiers suffered severe physical and psychological pressures, and implicit in most of what the Chinese said or did was a suggestion that these stresses would be removed and life be much happier if they took up a more cooperative attitude to their captors. The men had to undergo long marches, lasting maybe 2 weeks, en route to the prison camp assigned for them. During the march, they received little food, and in the interests of survival, were forced to compete with each other for what scant food, clothing, and shelter was on offer, which, Shine says, made it impossible for them to maintain group ties. Throughout, the Chinese raised the men's hopes by promising improvements in conditions, though stays in temporary camps along the way were no improvement whatsoever, and then dashed them by explaining that the UN was being obstructive, or that too many prisoners were being uncooperative and therefore all would have to suffer. Propaganda leaflets were distributed and the men were forced to sing communist songs. Permanent camp, when it was finally reached, however, forced the men to suffer physical and psychological stresses far beyond what they had so far endured. Shine does not here detail the physical tortures imposed on the men, but Merleau lists a number that were included in official American and British reports. These included: number 1, standing to attention or sitting with legs outstretched in complete silence from 4:30 till 11 p.m. and constantly being awoken during the few hours allowed for sleep. 2, enduring solitary confinement in boxes 5 foot by 3 foot by 2 foot. One soldier was known to have spent 6 months in such a box. Number 3, having liquids withheld for days to help self-reflection. Number 4, being bound with a rope, one end of which was passed over a beam and then around the neck like a hangman's noose, the other around the ankles. The prisoner was then told that if he slipped or bent his knees, he would be committing suicide. Number 5, being forced to kneel on jagged rocks with arms stretched up above the head, holding a large boulder. Number 6, being obliged in one camp to hold in the mouth a slim piece of wood or metal that a jailer pushed through a hole in the cell door. Suddenly, the jailer would knock the outer end of the wood or metal sideways, usually breaking the prisoner's teeth or splitting open his mouth. Number 7, being forced to march barefoot onto a frozen river where water was poured over their feet. Prisoners then had to stand for hours frozen to the ice, reflecting on their crimes. According to Shine's account, the prisoners had to get up at dawn, exercise for an hour, and then, after cereal or potato soup for breakfast at 8 a.m., spend the day at assigned duties or undergoing indoctrination. Whether a midday meal was served or not depended on the prisoner's attitude. Living groups comprised 10 to 15 people, and the Chinese were careful to separate the men by race and rank so as to undermine the established structure of the group, particularly by removal of leaders. Bearing out the insistence from the Chinese that rank was irrelevant, they were all of one brotherhood now. Sometimes very young or bumbling prisoners were put in charge of the rest. If any spontaneous semblance of order arose among the men, the Chinese broke up the group. And we will stop it right there and then pick this up in the next video. We are in chapter 2 of The Manipulated Mind. See you in the next video.